Hello everybody and welcome to another Blender to Train Sim tutorial. Apologies it's been so long since I did my last one. I honestly had no intention of leaving it this long, but I'm back and I'm going to be showing you how to sort of enhance your models a little bit more hopefully than sort of what you've done before. Hopefully you've now all been able to get to grips with the basics of modelling for Train Sim, and I want to show you sort of a little insight as to some of the extra bits you can do to get better with your modelling game. So the specific points I'm going to be guiding you through in this video going to be how to create objects that you can see through the texture. So we'll take this this telephone number or ident number up here. This texture here, the numbers themselves, it's actually got a completely see-through background, if you get what I mean. So they're like the stickers sort of thing. So the numbers aren't part of the texture; they're part of an extra model, which you'll see exactly how it works later on. Again, there's a little sort of branding on this billboard up here. That's got the exact same thing. That's see-through, and if there wasn't anything behind it, you would notice that you could see it'd just be the sort of the text floating. You wouldn't have a background to it. The second thing I'm going to be talking about is how to create glass effects. And I think that glass effects are one of my favourite things to create for Train Sim, and they always look great. And yeah, I'm going to be guiding you through how to sort of fine-tune and create your glass effects. And finally, I'm going to be showing you how to sort of create a bit of a shine on some objects, a specular layer to them, and get that working in the game so that you can see these benches. They're a bit shiny. They look a bit shiny. And you know, you can use that to just sort of enhance certain looks of your product. So without further ado, let's get on with it. Okay, so here we are in Blender. You'll see this is the model we're going to be working with of the bus stop that you would have just seen in the intro in the game. We're going to be looking at the three key objectives which I've spoken about. The first of which being how to create objects with textured holes in them, I guess. So, for example, we'll come up here and you'll notice this number. The phone number has or bus stop number, whatever it is, has a black background. Now, we don't want a black background, and as you can see from the texture which I've already created earlier, all of the sort of the texture actually has holes in the background. So we want to make sure that actually looks like it does there. And just a quick note, I have already created 90% of the textures for this model, so that I don't have to bore you in the creation of them, because we've already seen that. If you want to see how I created, or sort of the basics of how I sort of started creating this kind of thing, go back to my previous sort of 5 tutorials, and they'll tell you how to get started with Blender for Train Sim, with making stuff for Train Sim in Blender, and sort of the thought process that goes into creating a model for me. So we're going to want to create this object as a see-through object. Now, the easiest thing we can do, we can scroll down in our Materials tab, click on your object, Materials tab, scroll all the way down until you see Transparency, and just click that. Ta-da! It now shows as a transparent object, and I can prove that if I lift it up. There you go. You can see there's entirely zero background to it. That, however, isn't going to be enough to inform the game that you want it to be transparent. So we're going to come up to our IGS options. It might appear like that for you. I'm going to drop down the menu, and we are going to click Transparency. Now, a quick note. Last video, I told you that you had to add a material here called TRDiff, and it would be at the top. Forget I said that. That is for the old exporter. We can delete all of them now. Add that as just the only texture in here. If we go back to materials, this shader name drop-down menu actually replaces that TRDiff thing. And the equivalent of the TRDiff thing is this one, Train Basic Object Diffuse.fx. In the comments of, I think it was tutorial 4 for my original Blender tutorial series, Mark Hazeldine, shout out for you, thanks for letting me know, sort of brought it to my attention that I didn't really explain what the TR diff and the shaders actually meant. It'll become more apparent in this video, but I'll leave that till later when it's sort of more appropriate to talk about at a more appropriate time. So, in order to sort of finish this off, we're basically done, to be honest. That would export as it is to Train Sim, but we want to make sure we can bake the texture. So all we're going to do is simply just go check we've got our original texture, which we have assigned. Check we're using the correct mapping of it, which we are. We'll double check what the mapping of this one looks like. Right, so you'll notice I've just used the exact same mapping, and this admin thing here is down the bottom here, just on there. Double-sided, I've used the exact same texture, and all I've done is I've grabbed one of them, I've dragged it up, and then it's sort of two textures, which are going to make it easier to bake. So I'll go back to that. We got two. We're going to create a new image, and apologies for it being so messy. I recommend you try and keep your sizing of your anything sort of to do with text or images the same as much as you can, because it's sort of, if you try and bake it, you might find that you stretch your texture and your words, or you might sort of, if it's bigger it might stretch, if it's smaller you might find that the text becomes pixelated. So I always recommend to try and keep your sort of text and image bits as samey as possible, and also make them as large as possible. If you can afford to make them bigger, then go for it, make them bigger, because they always look better if they're a higher image quality. So all I'm going to do now is just bake as normal. Now the reason why I'm showing you this particular baking is because there's a slight difference to baking for a transparent object as there is for a regular object. There's one extra step, and if I jump into GIMP, I import all of these, I multiply, export as transfers, and that's simply just exporting the object as it is. Now, if I come back into Blender and I try and map that texture to transfers, you'll see that it's mapped, but there's no transparency. And you'll notice I've not touched the transparency icon here. Again, click it, click nothing happens. Again, up with the phone number, absolutely nothing happens. And if I lift it up, you'll see that nothing is indeed clear. So we go back to GIMP. All we're going to want to do, we're going to want to select all the bits we don't want on texture 15 with the actual texture and delete them. Now, this is significantly easier if your colours are sort of significantly different to each other. Blender likes to assume that similar colours are the exact same colour. So I'm just going to quickly chop this off, like so. And now we can select all of this and delete. You'll notice there's these bits at the bottom. I normally come along and it's only sort of created where you've baked too low to the bottom of the texture and it's just stretched it. You can obviously reduce how many pixels it extends off the end. You can leave it, you can cut it, whatever. As long as it's not interfering with anything else, it really doesn't matter whether it's there or not. Nobody's going to see it. Nobody's going to know it's there unless you go into your game. I'm just going to quickly grab the number from elsewhere, because you'll notice if I click on it, it actually selects the entire thing. This is what I'm talking about if the colours are too similar. It just selects the entire thing, which isn't helpful for me. Okay, so I've just grabbed it from another layer. Again, you can try and cut it out manually. It's a bit of a pain, to be honest. It might be easier just to change your texture slightly in colour, just to make it a little dissimilar from the colour which Blender bakes. But anyway, that's done. This I created earlier in a previous bit, so I will use that rather than having to cut it out on camera. Just replace that, and now we've got all our holes where we want them. You'll notice obviously this background we want on the London buses thing. We're going to go back to here. We've still got a transparency ticked. We've still got a transparency ticked there. we're going to add our texture, like so. And you'll notice this time, when I try and lift up the number, we have our transparency in it. Like so. So we can now see through the object. And that's exactly what we want. That is exactly what we want. All we do, make sure that this is ticked. This is ticked. Although, like I say, this doesn't affect Train Sim. It just makes Blender appear to know what it's doing. Again, this one there's no transparency to, but it doesn't matter. The game will still recognise, this bit isn't supposed to be transparent because the texture is solid. If you're making transfers like this, I normally recommend putting them on a separate object, because that means you can hide them when you texture bake, like so. If you bake with it there, you'll have a black block where the physical object is, because it blocks the light getting to the object behind. So I normally, if I've got little transfers that are sort of see-through and all that, I normally just hide them while I'm baking. And then that ensures that I'm not going to get a black block where I don't necessarily want it. So that's the only reason why these are part of a separate texture to everything else, to be honest. So that will now correctly export into Train Sim. Next thing I'm going to show you is the glass setup. Now the glass setup is probably the next harder thing to sort of understand. It's still reasonably simple. Nothing too crazy about actually understanding what's going on with this. So first of all, I'm just going to simply unwrap the texture for the glass. You'll see obviously our glass is pre-made. I've already made all that. That's fine. Actually, before I do that, I'm going to Control Shift Alt C to center it, and Control A. Oops. I didn't want to do that. Rotation in deltas. I wanted to do that. The rotation and scale. Right, and then remap it. It's the same map. I've already done that before, but you get the point. It's ready to go. Now, as far as texture baking is concerned, when it comes to glass, I honestly wouldn't bother. Glass is not worth texture baking. When you make it transparent, you can barely see any kind of texture on it. I made some dirty glass once, and to be honest, I might as well have not bothered. You can see so little of it, so I wouldn't even bother baking glass. As a result, I just don't. Also, with glass, when you're texture baking all these other objects, make sure you hide the glass as well, unless you like really want the glass to exist in the bake. But otherwise, if you don't hide your glass, you're going to have the back of this as all black. And of course, if there's a bit of glass there, it wouldn't be all black. It would be see-through. So apparently I'm missing a bit of glass there. I'll have to fix that later. Anywho, that's not important right now. What is important is setting up the glass. So I'm going to show you how to set up the texture for it, first of all. And to do that, we're going to jump into GIMP. I'm going to find a bit of glass which I've created before, simply just to get the colour from it. And then we're going to use the colour from that. So first of all, let's create a 64x64 texture. Again, if you're not baking, it doesn't matter what size your glass is. Delete that. Bring the glass in from the original. Select the colour. And we're going to create a new layer. And just do that. If you want to use this colour, this is the identity of the colour. For what I'm particularly using in this tutorial. You can make sort of stained glass if you add colours to it, and I'll show you how to get it transparent in a sec. But it will sort of display the colour in the game. So you come up to this opacity slider here, and you can do it manually or you can type. I normally type. I'm going to type 10%. Basically, the lower the slider, the less you'll be able to see of the glass. So if you put it to an opacity of 0, oops, I don't know what I did there, but I didn't mean to do that. If you put it to an opacity of 0, you're not going to be able to see anything. If you put it to 100, you're not going to see through the glass. It's just going to be a solid block. I seem to be using it at 10 now. I used to use it at 30, because I thought any lower than that, you'd be looking at too little texture in the glass. But if you look at glass in real life, you'll actually find you can't see much of it at all, which is obviously why birds fly into it. So you don't want to see a lot of the glass in Train Sim. So just a 10% opacity will do you. So we're going to export that. Export choose our directory, which if we go back, we can find our directory which we're working in. Find that, do that. Save it as glass. I'm not going to save it as a ridge because I'm not baking. This is the glass that I want to use in the game. Export that, and then we're done with GIMP. Close that on there. Close it on GIMP. Bring it back here. Open. Texture. Glass. Job done. Lovely. Glass exists. If we come up to our material, create a new material, and we're going to call it matte glass, because that's what it is. It's just glass. Again, the matte underscore is not important. It's just it just helps you identify that it's a piece of glass. Come into here, set up your texture, glass, set up your IGS export as glass. Go back to objects, to material, and this is where it gets interesting. What you're going to need to do, drop down to this IGS option, click the drop down menu, and rather than finding train basic object diffuse, or TRDiff as it was, you want to find train glass.fx. The equivalent for that would be to find TR glass. You'd want to create a TR glass, which again, do it the exact same way you'd create a TRDiff, none, and just name it TR glass. Again, that's not needed because this overrides it. This IGS drop down. Now, you would have thought for glass, you'd need to tick your transparency option. You don't. The TR glass material, and again, the material is what actually creates the effects in the game. The material tells the game, this object needs to look like this. So, and it needs to have certain properties. So, glass, again, you can see through, and it's got a bit of reflection on it. Glass with the effect, weather effects. I believe weather effects is where when you're in sort of the passenger view or cab view and you've got the rain running down your windows. I've never used it. Don't quote me on it. I don't know how to use it, to be honest. I've got no need to until I create a train, really. You're not going to want to put rainy glass on every single object because it's just going to lag your game out and you're going to have real performance issues. What you will want to do, however, is click transparency down here. This allows Blender to render the transparency of it. I'm just going to click flat and shadeless. But the transparent option down here allows Blender to show it. You will see some funny sort of rendering things. You see the maps has disappeared now. And also the surround on my adverts have disappeared. That's just Blender being silly. It doesn't seem to know how to do it. If you click on it, you can see that your objects actually do exist. And everything is fine. Okay, quick note from James in the future. When I went to export the model, I found that I had an issue with it. That issue was because I'd added only one texture reference to the TR glass. Now, TR glass counts as a specular material. And a specular material is basically anything that reflects a little bit of light off it. And it will become more apparent what specular material is when I move on to the next part of the tutorial. But basically, whenever you create a specular material such as glass, you need two texture references from it. And I normally use the exact same texture as I have used for the first one. But basically, the first texture is what is actually going to be seen by the person looking at it. The second texture, it just basically adds the reflection to it. If you don't have two, you're not going to be able to export the model into Train Sim. So make sure you put two in, and it will do it. Again, I don't really know the technicalities of how it all works, but I know that you need two in order for it to render correctly. Okay, so the final thing I'm going to show you is actually specular objects. Now, a specular object is basically an object which reflects a little bit of light off it. So we'll take a pipe, for example. If you look at a pipe, you'll notice that it's shiny, it's reflective, it reflects light off it. However, it's not as reflective as a mirror, and you can't sort of see your face or anything particular in it. And we're going to basically have a look at one of them and how to set that up. Now, to be honest, it's been a bit of a learning curve for me, because I'm really new to specular objects. I don't really like the look of them, if I'm honest. They don't do much for me, and I don't use them very often. But maybe if you can find a place for them, the most common place you find them is on trains, for example. Well, obviously glass and on trains. So if you ever open up the texture file for a train, you'll notice that said texture is slightly transparent. And the transparency is to do with the specularity of it. I'll explain more about why this transparency is there as we get further down the line. But first of all, let's set up our specular texture. So, we've got our sort of benches here, which we're going to use. Again, these benches are a bit reflective. You can't see anything in them, but you can see there's light reflecting off them. So we're going to use that as an example for this tutorial. First off, we're going to set up our material. So, new material, mat, benches, or whatever your object is going to be. Name it as such, of course. Scroll down until you find your IGS. It might be down like this. Press it and then open it up, of course. We're going to change our shader name to Train Spec Env. Train Bump Spec Env. Now, this is one of the bits I sort of learned myself while I was actually creating a tutorial itself. Originally, I used Train Bump Spec, and it didn't really do a lot. I believe that Train Bump Spec is only actually reflects lights, so point lights within the game. It doesn't affect the environmental textures around it. There's a load of different ways of rendering specular objects. Environmental mask, palette. I don't know what they do. I'm not going to try and pretend I know what they do for the tutorial. They're there. If you can find out how to use them, and if I find out how to use them in the future, I'll be more than happy to make another tutorial on explaining how they work. But for now, just ignore them. They are what they are. So we're going to create that. We're going to obviously set our texture up as normal. You can bake it if you want. I've already baked it, so I don't need to run through that part of the tutorial. We're going to create our texture quick and reference it. This is the baked version. Set it up ready for export. But there's one more thing we need to do with the texture before we actually do anything with it. Because see, I've got it open here. This is the baked version, so the bake of the texture and the bake of the ambient occlusion put together. What we're going to want to do, we're going to want to change the opacity of it. Now, the glass, you might sort of think, why would you change the opacity with it? I don't want an opaque bench. And you'll be right, you don't want an opaque bench. However, the opacity in this case actually relates to how much is reflected off of the bench. And I'll show you an example of if you've done it wrong and you've left it 100% opacity, because it doesn't look great. It reflects a lot of light and it just doesn't look realistic. So I'm going to drop it down to 20. We'll see what that's like. We can play about with it, obviously, if you want to. You might have a different view. You might look at 20 and think, yeah, it's perfect. Somebody else might look at 20 and think, no, it needs to be more reflective or less reflective. It depends what object you're building as well. So I'm going to export it like that. And we're going to export it as benches. I believe I was already in the correct directory. Export that. There we go. Exported. Reload it in the game. Or in Blender, sorry. Benches. Like so. And technically, we could click on material. We could click transparency. Sorry, not there. Transparency there. And you'll see that Blender renders it see-through. We don't want this, of course, so I'm going to untick that. Make sure this is unticked unless you actually have an object which you want to be see-through. Say you're making a piece of fence and you want some reflection in it. You might want to tick this option. I do not know how it works with reflective objects with holes in. If it might reflect on the hole, it might not. I am not aware. I can't comment on that at the moment. So if you've got a thing with a hole in it, have a go, play about with it, and let me know what happens with it. So yeah, we've got our materials, we've got our shader set up. We haven't got our texture set up. Like with the glass, as I added before, I found out in the export process that you need more materials, or more textures set up. So we're going to add another texture, 37, and we're going to add another texture. And just to prove, actually, that it doesn't matter what you use, I'm actually going to link 35, which is the glass, just to show you. Actually, no, let's go something more outlandish, shall we? Let's go for the number 6, the posters. They've got no sort of reflection on them. I'll just to show that it doesn't actually matter what you set up. I normally do all of them the same. If you're using train bump environment, train bump specular, you will only want 2. So your textures will look like this. If you're using this one, which I'm using, which reflects the ambient light as well, you're going to want 3 to reflect off. And basically, it just adds an extra level of reflection, I believe. Again, don't quote me on the details. I'm not technical in this sense. I just know how it sort of works and that it exists in this way. Anywho, let's get this thing exported into Train Sim, and then I will show you how it all works in-game. Okay, so I've created my scenery blueprint. It's just a standard scenery blueprint, the exact same one we used for the last tutorial. It's all here. I've exported my IGS. I've done my RW Ace tool to convert all my textures into Ace files. I'm now just going to name everything up, and I've already got the name pre-prepared. I know what I want to name it. Again, you can translate it if you want. I don't know these languages. I don't really want to use Google Translate because Google Translate can be dodgy as anything, as we all know. So I'm going to give that a miss. Clutter. I mean, you don't even have to actually add anything to these. You can just leave them blank, but then you'd have a hard time if somebody in German, for example, wanted to use this asset. They'd have a hard time trying to find it. So track infrastructure, that's not what I clicked. Clutter is what I wanted. Then we're just going to add the reference. We're going to go all the way down the reference chain. Scenery. Clutter. Again, you should have already created this. If you're at this stage, should have created it. It doesn't matter. You're probably building something different to what I'm building. Just add your references however you want. Create it. As long as you reference them with a backward slash between each file you've created, it's fine. It's all good. And then reference my IGS. There we go. We know it's linked because we can now open the file from there. It's not hidden anymore. Just FA export into Train Sim. I have already exported once, so you'll probably see it flicker and all that. There we go. Right, here we go. This is our model. I'm just going to flip it round so it's actually in the sun, the bit we want to sort of see. And there we go. Right, so there's our sort of see-through object, as you can see. You could also set this up as a decal, I guess, which is a different type of material. I don't think it needs any extra texture references. It might do have a play with it. It's been a while since I've used one, to be honest. But as you can see, our glass, I'll bring it round to somewhere more easier to see the glass. The glass is exported quite nicely. I quite like the look of that. It's got a bit of reflection to it. You know, you can see a bit, but it's also not too sort of clear or too sort of translucent that you actually can't see through it. You can see perfectly clear through it. It looks reasonably realistic. I'm happy with that, yeah. And I believe that problem we found earlier with the glass, I believe it's just a face being flipped the wrong way around. Because if you look at this, you'll notice it looks like it's a bit thicker. And that's probably because there's 2 bits of glass acting on each other and no bits of glass this side. So I'll just flip that face when I go back into editing. The benches, I'll bring them round into the light. I'll tilt the model back as well so that it brings them into the light a bit more because of the shelters a bit in the way. You see they've got a bit of reflection to them. They're reflecting a little bit of light. It does darken the effect, which might be fixed by a different sort of texture. That's quite cool, to be fair. Look at that. The way it's actually going around by differences in the colour. So that's just a flat texture. It's got no reference to that whatsoever. But it's actually sort of worked out that maybe there's a difference there, and it's sort of calculating something. That's really cool. That's quite advanced the way it does it. If I now go back to GIMP. I set this opacity to 100. And I shall export that. Let that export. Get this ready. And convert. Re-export into Train Sim. Like so. I'll flip it back round to where we were before. It's not really doing a lot, is it? It's a bit bright. So it's a bit dark even, whatever. It's sort of, yeah. It doesn't look great really, does it? So if I put it on 10%, hopefully it changes. Hopefully it changes. Let's do that. Benches. Let it do its thing. Do your thing. Come on, do your thing. Convert that. Export that. Failed. Oh, it's probably geometry. Oh, that's why. That normally helps to have the geometry set correctly. That's what happens if you don't do that then. There we go. I think it's actually the same, you know. Again, I'm not an expert with these. No, I think it is a bit better. It is a bit less intense sort of thing. Again, like I say, I'm not an expert with specular objects. I know how to use the glass. I can use these obviously. It is my weaker area. I don't use them very often. I'm not a particular fan of how they look. But if you want to use them, they're there. That's how you use them. Go experiment with them. See what you can do with them. And yeah. So that's basically it for the tutorial. The next one. There we go. Haha. Have light. The next tutorial I do will most likely be to do with lighting. To be honest. So setting up point lights, setting up child objects because it relates. I know that sounds a bit outlandish, but it does relate. So setting up point lights, child objects, all that sort of stuff. I'll probably use this same model because funnily enough, it actually has a light in it. But the same principle as I use for setting up the light on this object will apply to street lamps, house lighting, building lighting, anything else that needs a light. It's going to be the exact same principle. So do stay tuned for that. I shouldn't be hopefully too long before I make that tutorial. Thank you very much for watching, everybody, and I will see you all next time. Goodbye.